This is the Overton Pod. Hello, Kanthan.
Back again after a delay of more than a week. The masses have been trampling our doors down to say, when are you next back on air?
Yes, lots of upsetness. Lots of upset. As you can hear, my voice is not perfect. So recording this a little bit worse for wear, but we will soldier on. We came into the studio talking about old cigarette ads, actually, which was...
And I was making out a case for why you should actually be smoking cigarettes, because if you're a medical doctor, doctors prefer Camels.
If I was, and that was the old saying: doctors prefer Camels. But we were saying how great those ads were. I mean, the Peter Stuyvesant ads were in the cinema were just epic.
I'll go one step further, and I'll say the world was a better place when people used to smoke freely. I understand that America's productivity and world productivity went through the roof because cigarettes had the dual effect. The one, they would actually stimulate the brain, and two, they would actually suppress hunger. And so overall productivity increased quite drastically. And the overall impact on society, because smokers actually died younger, meant that at the end of the day, the economy as a whole benefited. We must take
less boomers, basically.
Yes, we must take an entirely pragmatic approach to this, bring smoking back. And
Make smoking
by the way,
great
there's a
again.
recent study over the past week. I should have actually pulled up the reference, but I'm sure that Grok will help people find it, that showed that there's a direct correlation between smoking cigarettes and an increased level of testosterone.
Yeah, there is. There's a correlation between nicotine and testosterone levels, essentially. And that's why a lot of people seem to be pro.
So again, this is part of the Great
nicotine.
Reset. It was, to tone down the overall levels of masculinity around the world, and that's the reason why there was a war against smoking. And by the same token, you have the push for an increase in cannabis, which, as we all know, has this effect of just making people just...
Well, that hasn't worked out very well, has it? Interesting. I saw someone today, not today, earlier last week, actually, saying that they felt they were wrong about the cannabis ban. Obviously, they were very pro legalizing it. This is in the US. And a lot of American cities have become worse for wear after having legalized it. I think... probably because there's not a middle road on it. So before it was illegal, you went to jail for even having a little bit of the stuff. And now it's become a free-for-all where people will sort of sit on the side of a public road in a public area and smoke weed, which obviously smells a lot. And as Ben Kopinski always says, it's the smell of poverty. I think probably a middle road about where we probably have come to in South Africa, which is, if you want to smoke it in your own home.
Consider, for example, in the Netherlands, pot has been legal for the longest time, but you're not allowed to smoke it in the street.
Yeah.
So
that seems like a reasonable...
I don't see what the problem is. And it's ditto in the case of public drinking. I mean, as far as I'm aware, in most parts of the world.
Yeah, you can't drink in public.
Yeah. So
yeah, that sounds like the sort of reasonable middle road. On a lot of the stuff.
But it sounds like these problems that you're describing come directly from a lack of basic enforcement of rule of law.
Well, I remember cigarettes. I mean, you're saying about testosterone and World Economic Forum stuff, but I will say that it's more linked to the fact that it came from countries like England and Australia, and to an extent Europe, and Canada as well, who all have national public health systems. Which pay for people's healthcare. And so the problem is when you allow the government to pay for your healthcare, then the government has to manage the behaviors that influence health because they're the payer. So they look at it and
these are governments that believe that red meat is bad for us. These are
which is why they're trying to ban that stuff as well.
That animal fats are bad for us.
But anything that they can show is bad for you. Right, so if a study comes out, remember, politicians are not smart people. We'll get onto that a little bit later with the VAT increase stuff.
And we will speak slowly at that point so that they can understand us.
Essentially, someone makes a researcher, a scientist comes up with a study. It says something like cigarettes cause an extra 50,000 deaths a year, but on the way to causing 50,000 deaths, they cause an extra 100,000 years worth of usage of the health system, right? And so the politician looks at that and goes, all right, well, what's the cost of that? They don't necessarily question whether that's true or how much veracity there is to that, or even necessarily, well, okay, the smoker has now died and used a lot of healthcare on the way to dying, but what does that mean for us not having to keep them alive beyond sort of 70, for example, for an extra 15 years with all the ailments that old people get? So they look at it and go, oh, well, it's costing us a lot of money. And then they go, well, we pay for healthcare, so we need to get rid of these cigarettes because they're costing us money. And the same would go for red meat, and the same would go for any study that comes out. If you can convince the politicians, again, not smart people, if you can convince them that anything causes some sort of damage to something they pay for, they look at it and go, oh, well, we're doing a net good by banning it, by stopping it, by preventing it. And I think that's where the cigarette stuff largely came from. Look, I don't think most of us really miss people smoking everywhere all the time, all over the show. I mean, I know people bitch and moan about the fact that they used to be able to smoke on aircraft. I'm not unhappy that we don't smoke on aircraft anymore. It's an enclosed space. I don't particularly like the smell of cigarette smoke.
Explain something to me, though.
Sure.
Why is it every single aircraft in the world still has ashtrays on the toilet doors? On the outside.
Not the new
every single aircraft in the world.
Not the new ones.
No, the new ones.
Not the latest, the greatest.
No. All of them, they have ashtrays on the doors. I promise you.
I didn't specifically look for it, but I'm pretty sure I was on
everyone who's listening to this and who's about to board a Safir or a lift flight.
Oh, no, those planes definitely have
No. But those are all recent planes. They 737-800s from the past decade.
Yeah, I think the most of those planes are 10 to 15 years old, maybe a little bit older. And so I don't know when the transition happened. But if you got like a 787 today, you won't find that.
No, actually, the 787s that I've flown on from Qatar still have them. The Embraers that I've flown fairly recently have them. Now, this is still very much a thing.
I don't have an answer for you then.
And more to the point, why do they still have no smoking signs on the planes?
So is an interesting question. Why, when things light up? Although again, I went on a more modern aircraft recently, and they didn't have when the seatbelt sign came on, there was no smoking sign. It was just obviously taken for granted.
Okay, which aircraft was this, and which airline was this?
It was one of the new. It was either 787 or an A350 that didn't have. I think it was an Airbus. But yeah, it's an interesting thing you've noticed. Bit random, but interesting. There is so much to discuss, Kanthan. I don't even know where to begin. We've started on.
Okay, so Zelensky is visiting us. You're aware of this?
Yes, he's about to arrive. Or he's here already.
He's touched down already. Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. This being recorded on Thursday.
Yes.
I haven't seen any information on that. I'm not really that interested in.
Can you imagine our mainstream media actually being aware of the fact that there is a state visit by the former president of Ukraine? And I have to say he's former president of Ukraine because his term of office expired quite a while back.
Well, I think you should just call him the dictator of Ukraine.
That's actually a very fair thing to say. Yes, the dictator of Ukraine. But he's apparently being welcomed by Ramaphosa. The international
media. I think
media,
those who are currently getting very upset with us, just to clarify, he has not been democratically elected. He was originally, but he suspended elections. Everyone thinks that it's okay because there's a war or some story like that.
And he suspended them indefinitely.
And he was part of passing the laws that made that suspension occur. But yeah, he hasn't been democratically elected to office again. And so the longer he stays in government, the more he becomes like Robert Mugabe or like Mahmoud Abbas from the Palestinian Authority, etc.
But you must admire the ability of...
Vladimir Putin, for that matter.
Yeah. Well, although, in fairness, Putin did actually conduct elections in the midst of...
Yeah, he had an inverted commas election.
It's as much of an inverted commas election as the Biden election in 2020 was.
Okay.
I'm very clear.
We are
about
getting
this.
very down into the weeds. All right. So, what do you think about Zelensky being here?
So the
isn't it a
fascinating
bit
thing,
hypocritical?
I don't want to waste too much time on Zelensky because while he is out here trying to drum up support for, let's just put a couple of things in perspective here. You might remember at the start of this conflict, the Ramaphosa took a group of African leaders and a plane load of journalists, in inverted commas,
Yeah.
and landed in Warsaw, and most of them were not able to make it across to Ukraine because the Ukrainians said...
Do you remember the whining of the journalists on the plane, though?
I
That
do
was
remember the
fantastic.
whining of the journalists, but I very specifically remember the fact that the Ukrainians were saying we have no interest whatsoever in talking to these Africans who are clueless about what is going on in this part of the world.
Right.
And they are all flunkies of Russia. And now suddenly you have Zelensky pitches up in this part of the
In
world.
a formal state visit.
In a formal state visit, and he's been quite feted. But more to the point, who was here a short while ago meeting with the South African government? Ursula von der Leyen, who, is... I've seen a straw poll right now, and she's one of the two top contenders for the most evil woman in the world. Mm-hmm. Not my words; these are what people out there have been putting out. But Ursula von der Leyen
Head of the EU,
the head of the unelected leader of the EU, I must say,
another one, yeah,
yes, and had substantial meetings with people in authority on both sides of the GNU. So she met with the ANC and with the DA, and of course committed to all of the talking points that are that the Western world is so famous for, such as the just energy transition.
Yes. And the DA recently coming out against any fossil fuels, stating that we must only develop renewables.
I'd like to ask a very specific question to the DA. How are you going to build wind turbines without fossil fuels?
They can't answer that question. They don't want to answer that question. And as we've discussed, you've got someone like Dion George, calls himself a doctor, not a doctor. And he is running the show there and pushing all this ideology on behalf of government because he's Minister of Fisheries and Environment and whatever else it is that they've tagged on there. Forest, fisheries, and the environment, I think. And yeah, he's basically pushing that. He is trying to do exactly what Barbara Creasy from the ANC did in that position, which is to throttle Eskom's usage of coal power plants. So we will have load shedding again directly as a result of the DA.
Well, the other absurd things that they've done in the name of environmentalism, of course, is they shut down our refineries, which removed our ability to be productive in terms of our entire petrochemicals industry. Because people forget it's not just about fuel. It's about all of the byproducts that actually make literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of jobs possible in this country.
Yeah, and if you can refine fuel, there's a lot of other stuff you can do then as a result of that. First, the byproducts it creates, which goes into petrochemical industry and then enables that whole industry to exist, Sasol being a good example.
We can't have roads without tar, guys. Come on. I mean, can we be...
Yeah, you want your potholes fixed.
Yes.
Turns out you probably need a refinery to do that. Or you've got to import the stuff then.
And right now we're importing this stuff.
Yeah,
and so
absolutely. You also can't export, so you can't package
so just
fuel
to
for
kind
export.
of wrap up the Zelensky thing, because we have more interesting stuff to talk about, and frankly, Zelensky's not going to have a country within 6 months, but at the rate at which the
he can choose. He can choose a shitty option, which is to give Russia what they've captured. It doesn't matter what you stand on the wall.
But the point is, it's not a question of giving Russia what they've captured. Russia's taken it.
Yeah.
And you've got no way of taking it.
He can
back.
choose to sign a deal in which he goes, fine, we accept you've taken it and we're just going to call it quits and we're going to keep the country that remains. Or he can do, as you've said on this podcast before, he can continue fighting and basically lose everything.
So Russia, as you know, wiped out about 70,000 troops that were sitting in the Kursk region of Russia. And subsequent to that, Russia has now crossed into Ukraine proper, and they are now establishing effectively a demilitarized zone in the Sumy region, which borders Kursk, which, really at the point at which the Russians made it clear that the Kursk region was not there for the taking, the Ukrainians should have pulled back and built a fortification. And what's very likely to happen now is that the Russians are going to establish this effective demilitarized zone at the north there. Meanwhile, they're very close to taking the last few major cities, including Zaporizhia city itself, which is the capital of the Zaporizhia Oblast, which is one of the 4 regions that Russia has now taken control of. So remember that when we started this thing, Russia was just basically there to try and ensure the safety of the Donbass regions. And the reason why they chose...
if you look at the map, that is very much... it's fascinating to listen to you because you're one of the people that has an actual in-depth understanding of Ukraine. And there's so many people who come out and are against the war or have an opinion, but you actually understand the geography.
Yes.
You actually understand the
geography is
troop
everything.
movements.
Yes.
So it's fascinating to listen to you because I'm not as well-versed. But I do know that if you look at where this all started, it was very much on the border of Ukraine and Russia. We're not talking hundreds of kilometers. We're talking in the tens of kilometers. Mm-hmm. And so if this all started and they had gone and made the Minsk agreement, stuck to that, the reality is that Russia would have gained very little territory.
Russia would have no territory, apart from Crimea, which... they
is
were
theirs already.
Yeah, which historically
Obama gave them.
Yeah, which historically has been theirs, and that's been pretty much the case. But where Ukraine is right now, so to put this in perspective, Zaporizhia, the city, as opposed to the oblast, is probably about 20% of the size of Mariupol. Okay, which the Russians took effortlessly. They took effortlessly. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, what Russia has been doing is they've been systematically occupying the territories around all of these areas. So, at the point at which they finally move into these areas, there will be no contest whatsoever.
Because they've created a siege, essentially.
And more to the point, once they've taken control of these cities, they will then have control of the Dnieper River. And without the Dnieper River, Ukraine is effectively finished because the Dnieper it's a navigable river by and large, and it allows for the free movement of goods across most of Ukraine. And at the point at which Zelensky is not able to secure the Dnieper, it's pretty much game over. Now, he's out here trying to drum up support. And my theory around where this is coming from is the fact that at the point at which Trump upset the world order by coming into power, you suddenly had the scramble for realignment that was happening around the world. And now the EU rallied around immediately and said, well, if US aid is removing money from South Africa, we are going to step in and fill that gap. In other words, they're going to continue owning our government by buying them out. And of course, the interesting thing is that they have allies on both sides. So both the ANC and the DA are very happy to suck up to the EU.
Yes, because the DA are ideologically aligned with the EU.
Completely, and they're ideologically opposed to Trump.
Exactly, and the DA and the ANC obviously will just take the money happily.
So the reason why, in spite of the fact that Zelensky effectively said at the time, Africans are too stupid to understand what's going on in Ukraine, and they have no business coming here. Now he's out here and essentially taking orders from his EU masters because they're the ones who are saying,
so we're essentially just a toy. Because what happened is Trump comes in and you could argue that of all the countries in the world, Trump has probably been the most harsh on us and China. I think those two countries. But I think probably the worst on us. If you look at language that he's used. So he said, China's ripping us off, and obviously their tariffs are in the hundreds of percent currently. They are talking about dropping those to 50 to 60%. But the bottom line is that Trump has made multiple statements targeting South Africa, allegedly over, mistreatment of white minorities, Afrikaners, etc. I don't think it's just about that. I think there's a longer strategic play happening here. But there's no other country that he's been as focused on in those terms. And so suddenly, from being a useless country at the bottom of Africa that has nothing to offer of value, we're a way that the EU and Ukraine can irritate Trump further. Because you can bet that Trump will know Zelensky is here, and that will rile up the White House. And obviously, exactly as you're referring to, give the EU a bit of an upper hand. Look, we're making friends with your enemies, and there's nothing you can do about it. And we're going to stand with South Africa while you want to kind of bring them down, I suppose. And yeah, that's why Zelensky's here. I mean, if you go back and look at the statements, it's exactly as you said. Zelensky wanted nothing to do with us. We, quite arrogantly, at the beginning of all of this, if you remember, turned around and said we want to negotiate a peace settlement. We wanted to be the mediator. And it was half taken seriously until we let Russian ships start docking in our military harbors. And then everyone sort of realized, all right, not only is it not at all a possibility, it's a complete joke and a farce. So,
look, from my perspective, and I've said this before, I have no problem with Russian ships docking in our harbors. I have no problem with American ships docking in our harbors on the assumption that they are here to pick up fuel and get serviced and do all of the other stuff that people do, because we're not at war with Russia. We don't have sanctions against Russia. And the idea that we should be turning away Russian ships just because they're Russians just doesn't make any sense to me. Should there be transparency around what's happening? Should we actually be telling people, yes, we have a commercial arrangement where they're welcome to come and actually fuel up? But look, we do have cooperation with Russia at other levels. For example, it would be damn near impossible for us to have a meaningful access to Antarctica if not for the ability to rely on not only Russian icebreakers, but American icebreakers and so forth in the event of our base down there actually ending up in trouble. By the way, you're probably aware of what went down at our base in Antarctica.
All right, let's finish, and then we'll talk about that. But let's finish. So,
okay,
you think Zelensky's going to accomplish anything other than to just basically put a finger in the eye of the Americans?
No,
because that's for me what's happening
exactly.
here.
This is another attempt to rename Santon Drive, which does nothing other than to irritate the Americans. It's extremely short-sighted on the part of all of the players that are involved.
And in some ways, you will have a bit of a pick-me-up in terms of the relations between the EU and South Africa, because you just had Ursula here promising us billions to do bad things with our energy grid and amongst other things.
Promising us billions in loans.
Yeah.
We need to be aware of this.
Your children
loans.
and grandchildren will pay for these mistakes.
It's not like, we're taking coal from under our feet and burning it because it's our coal.
Yes.
But no, we're meant to be buying stuff from the EU with money that they loan us.
Yes,
and that's their just energy transition.
Giving our coal to them at a discount on top of that, by the way. Okay, that's fine. Zelensky's going to come and he's going to parade around, and the people at all of our mainstream media outlets are going to wet themselves, and then he's going to leave, and it's going to be a finger in the eye of the Americans. Yes, we had a problem with the base at Antarctica because we send people there for a 1-year period. Essentially, you go there in summer because you can't get there in winter.
Yes.
Bearing in mind that summer is still 4 degrees or something ridiculous on a good day. In winter, you talk about minus 40. And so you go there in summer, you go to the camp, which is a couple of sort of buildings that look more like outhouses, and you do experiments. They send scientists there and inverted commas. I always find a lot of these things to be, it's kind of like people who say they're explorers. There used to be that one guy who got sponsored by Jamison and Nando's and all that kind of stuff. And he used to take a car and drive around all of Africa. And I used to think, wow, what a fucking cool job, because the guy has figured out a way for other people to pay for his holidays. Right. And so I look at scientific trips to Antarctica the same kind of way. Someone who is a scientist has obviously gone, I feel like an adventure. I don't want to sit in a lab in Edenvale. I want to go to Antarctica. And then, that's kind of what ends up happening. I'm not sure how much value we're getting out of that.
People are now actually going to believe that there are labs in Edenvale. Stop that, John.
All right. But they sent a crew of 8 or 10 people and women and men, and then there were allegations of sexual harassment that occurred, that apparently happened, and now those people are all stuck there together because I think they've still got 8 months or something around there to go until they come back. And that's where we're sitting currently. So I don't know if you had heard anything else.
I really don't want to delve into it, other than the fact that if you are going to be sending people off on these missions, you just to be absolutely sure that they are not carrying any of this type of baggage when they go down there.
Yeah, I think it's tough. I think the reality is when you have a situation where you put people into confined space, where they're away from civilization, and essentially they're cut off from the world. So in some respects, there are no rules. The rules are the rules.
This is literally the plot of every sci-fi horror movie. Have we not actually learned anything?
But it's exactly what I say about the trip to Mars. It's why I'm not sure that what Musk wants to accomplish he will be able to achieve. Although I will note that he isn't trying to send 10 people at once. He's trying to send hundreds. And I think this is exactly the reason why. Because I reckon if you send 10 people on a spaceship to Mars, and they get there after, they say they'll get there, the best case scenario, after about 8 to 9 months. They get there after 9 months, and they're so far from Earth that Earth doesn't apply out there. Right? You could do anything, and no one's going to do anything to you, right? Only the other 9 people you're with. And so it only takes one person, and the chances that someone's smart, who's managed to get onto a Mars mission, they're all going to be intelligent people. The chances of none of those people being sociopaths is 0. All right.
Correct, yes.
And so for me, I say, well, let's say it's 5 men and 5 women, and one of the men is a sociopath. He's going to kill the other men and make the woman his harem, basically, right? And establish a colony in that way. And I know that sounds maybe sick and perverted, but it is the script of every...
No, but it is the nature of the species. The only reason why we don't have that happening on a regular basis is because civilization.
Yes, we created inverted commas, societal contract.
Yes.
And you know that if you do that in everyday life in the city where you live, the cops may very well come and find you and arrest you, and then you go to a court system and they will try you. At least that's how it's meant to work. And for many of the reasons why we have crime in South Africa is actually because that system has broken down. The reason we have rape and murder at the level we do, part of it has to do, obviously, with issues in society in and of themselves. But it's also got to do with the fact that there aren't consequences. Somebody knows that they can do that and probably get away with it. And so once you start showing consequences, the volume of people who are willing to take the risk decreases. And that's just evidentiary. It's if you want the greatest piece of evidence we currently have in the past 10 years, El Salvador. That's it's all there for you to see. Very interesting. I hope everyone there is okay and it's been sorted. Allegedly, it has been sorted out. There was a bit of a so-called psychotic break, I think, was how it was kind of reported or spoken about by the spokespeople. I wanted to ask you a completely different topic. What did you think of Douglas Murray on Joe Rogan together with Dave Smith? Did you see that whole controversy?
I did, and yes, and I've listened through most of that conversation. Yeah.
And?
So where do you want me to start on this? Okay, so there's a couple of things that are involved.
But should I give background for people who haven't at all listened,
Yeah, by
watched.
all means. Yeah, go ahead.
All right, let's. So Douglas Murray, I think, is well known to most people. Has written many books. Most famous of those would probably be The Strange Death of Europe, in which he speaks about the immigration crisis in Europe and how it's changing Europe in and of itself and is killing what Europe once was. He's an interesting character in that, and I've met Douglas, and he is incredibly smart. He's charismatic, and he's just so erudite, really, when you sit and have a conversation with him. But he's interesting in that a lot of the issues that he kind of fights for are issues, I suppose, which would be cast in a right-wing light. And yet he really is more of a sort of left-wing centrist, I would sort of classify him as. If this was 2000, it'd be very normal to see him on every mainstream platform, and he'd be standard talking head. Year 2000, year 2025, he's kind of sort of on the border of that. And so he goes on Rogan because he's now written a new book. I think it's called The Death of Democracy. Forgive me if I get that slightly off. But essentially, it's mainly about what happened in Israel on the 7th of October 2023. And it springboards from that to talking about Israel's democracy, Islamic fundamentalism, and the threat that the attack on Israel places on Israel, but in actual fact places on Western democracies. I haven't read the book, so I can't tell you whether it's any good or not, but that's what it's about. Now, he's doing a book tour, so he went on Rogan. He's been on Rogan before. And Rogan has taken a lot of flack recently because he's had people like Dave Smith, who's a comedian, but who, since the 7th of October, has basically been speaking a hell of a lot, pretty much nonstop, about Israel. And he's very anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. Some people would say he's anti-Semitic, or at least he speaks in a way that is anti-Semitic. He's had Dave on many times. That's Rogan at least. And then he's had people like this guy called Ian Carroll, who believes in every conspiracy theory under the sun, including that the Jews control everything. And then Daryl Cooper, who sort of classes himself as a historian, but won't let you call himself a historian, even though he constantly talks about history, and then tells you what actually happened in history and how the history you've been taught is wrong. So, for example, one of the famous things that he sort of stood up for is that in World War II, Churchill was actually the bad guy. And he was the main problem. And if it wasn't for Churchill, we probably wouldn't have had World War II, according to him. And if it wasn't for Churchill, we wouldn't have had the death and suffering that we had, according to him. So those are the types of people Rogan has been platforming. Murray arrives now with his book, and you would have expected a one-on-one because Rogan doesn't really do debates. He has had a couple of people on. He had, I can't remember, that actor who thinks he knows physics, and then Eric Weinstein to talk about a whole bunch of physics principles because the actor thinks, the guy from Iron Man 1, I forget his name.
But to be fair, Rogan has had those people on in their individual capacities.
He's had them on in their individual capacities, and then he has had debates, but they're not really debates, and they've been quite friendly. Rogan comes on with Smith, and it doesn't go well, in my opinion, for anyone, but go for it.
So basically the issues that we need to deal with here are kind of two things. And so the one thing is, does Rogan give a platform to people who have theories that are factually incorrect? And the answer to that is yes. And then you have Douglas Murray, who's pointing out correctly that a lot of the stuff that a lot of these people have been saying, and Dave is one of those examples, it's just factually incorrect. The question, of course, comes down to whether or not you're a freedom of speech absolutist, which is what I happen to be. Mm-hmm. And from my perspective, I would rather Rogan be giving a platform to as many people as he possibly can, as long as we have a situation, which I believe we do, where there's enough of a body of intelligent people who are able to then publicly call out those people and point out exactly why they're wrong. And it's very clear to me that on the basis of the ideas that were traded, Douglas Murray is very clearly able to shoot down every single argument that was made around, just the sheer propaganda around the October 7th attacks.
Well, one of the things he's been attacked on.
But the question that it comes back to is, and the thing that I have a problem with in terms of what Murray was saying, is that he's making out a case for not giving platforms to people. And
he's making an anti-experts argument, which is a very dangerous argument to make in this day and age.
Yes.
Because experts died with COVID.
Correct.
And so people have a fundamental mistrust because there were many experts involved in that who all got it wrong very, very badly. And so people don't trust those experts anymore and a lot of other experts. And obviously they've started to retrospectively look at things and go, well,
although in fairness, John, we must remember that there were a lot of experts who got it right, and those experts were deplatformed because they were told that their ideas were inappropriate. Wrong. And it cuts to the chase of what we are talking about right now.
You are right about that, absolutely. So it's interesting. Someone I know well had said, on the one side, yes, you can't believe every expert, but that doesn't mean you should believe every idiot. And I think you've also just made an excellent point, which is that a lot of experts, at least the experts given the platform during COVID, got it wrong. But a lot of experts who weren't given a platform or who were deplatformed did get it right.
But Acharya is a case in point.
Absolutely. And so... But I think the problem was how Murray made that argument. A lot of people got riled up by that in terms of the appeal to some sort of expertise and how he went about it.
Look, I get his frustration. I have that sense of frustration when I see a lot of the sheer idiocy that gets peddled by people who happen to have platforms. And nowhere is the smoke clear than if you turn on any of the TV channels here in South Africa right now, and you see the sheer levels of stupidity that get parroted by these anchors who see themselves as what is it, defending truth, as the Daily Maverick is so fond of seeing. And yes, and my response to that is that there needs to be this constant calling out of the fact that these people are just basically wrong. And the way in which you do that is by having precisely the type of public engagement that Rogan does have. I don't expect Rogan to be an expert on this and to be, calling out people himself. He does frequently, and, he will tell his producer, fact check this for me. And he does that kind of thing in real time. But at the same time, I'm very wary of saying that we should be going back into this very dangerous territory where we designate certain people as experts and we try and deplatform those that we think are not expert. But at the same time, effectively what we are doing is we get to adjudicate who's meant to be an expert and who's not.
Look, I have to support you. I mean, I'm on the same page on free speech absolutism. I had to correct someone recently with regards to the shouting fire in a crowded theater.
That is such a warn trope.
Which, it's not only warned, it's that the Supreme Court of the United States, which is where it comes from originally, overruled a previous ruling that had been made, saying that was not a valid claim. In other words, that you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. In that context is everything. And so, I'm on the free speech absolutist train. I think,
but more to the point, if you shout fire in a crowded theater, there are many other things that you can be charged with that are not related to free speech. So you can be charged with reckless endangerment.
Sure.
as a starting point.
If and it all comes down to intent and what the purpose of shouting fire. In fact, if there was a fire in a crowded theatre and you didn't shout fire, you could also be charged with negligent endangerment or something to that effect, because you should have notified other people that there was a fire. For example, let's say you see the fire and then you walk out and save yourself and don't save everyone else. There may be charges against you. So it's a very bad trope.
Or you might get sent to Antarctica as a scientist.
So, I think I'm with you on that. I think I agree with Murray's perspective. And I think that he was incredibly frustrated. Firstly, I could see that he was frustrated. I watched some of the stuff on YouTube as opposed to watching it, listening only. And you could tell he was frustrated. I've also met the man, so I have a better sense of his sort of demeanor and personality. And I mean, there were several points at which he literally just put his hand on his head or sort of looked at the sky in an exasperated way. Joe Rogan has subsequently mocked him for having said, "Have you been?" And done it it was quite funny actually how he mocked him. In fairness, Murray's got a obviously deep British accent, and Rogan made the comment, have you been? But the point is that the issue Murray was trying to raise is that Dave Smith has lots to say. Ironically, only really on this issue. He is a libertarian. He has positions, obviously retarded positions on a whole bunch of things. But he's really been hyper focused on this, but he hasn't bothered to go to the area where he's talking about. And Murray was trying to point out, well, I have been there. And so I'm refuting some of the things that you're saying based on the fact that I've seen it with my own two eyes.
Well, to put this in perspective, the blatantly stupid stuff that Dave says, for example, he says that Israel's an apartheid state because the Palestinians can't vote there. No, actually, the Palestinians...
It's a different country.
Yeah, they do get to vote in Palestine. And the last time they had an election, they put Hamas in power, and there's been no election since.
They've literally petitioned the UN to become and be recognized as a country. So if someone wants to be their own country, how can you request a vote in a different country? That would be ridiculous.
But to my earlier point, when you have people like Dave saying inherently stupid stuff like that, it's very easy to immediately call them out and at the same time point out that they are Israeli Arabs who vote, who are represented in parliament, who are represented in the Supreme Court, who are represented in all walks of government. Yes.
Yeah.
And who, frankly, intensely dislike the Palestinians.
I think what's also valuable here is that for me, I don't think the Rogan podcast was particularly helpful. What I saw is that what you wanted to see was what you saw. In other words, if you went into the podcast in the position of being on Dave Smith's side in terms of all of this stuff, you left being on Dave Smith's side. And if you went on Murray's side, you probably left on Murray's side. But what has been, I think, helpful in my view is that Dave has subsequently gone on multiple platforms to talk about the podcast. Murray's been on a couple as well, including Bill Maher's show. Ooh, we must talk about Bill Maher. And Dave Smith has made himself look a bit more like an idiot on those subsequent follow-ups because he didn't have Murray as the foil. And when he didn't have Murray as the foil, he actually makes himself look like more of an idiot. And I think Dave Smith has actually destroyed his reputation quite significantly subsequently. And that's what free speech allows to happen.
But more to the point, I think I will agree with you when you say that, people who are on Team Dave Smith would be on their Team Dave Smith when they left, and people who are on Team Murray would be on Team Murray when they left. But at the same time, if you take the entire spectrum of people who listen to Rogan, I would make out the case that people who sit through a 3-hour conversation are generally smart enough to not be drawing their opinions based on what their feelings were ahead of time, and that they will listen through the entire discussion. So, apply the Pareto principle to it. I know you hate it, but I'm saying that 80% of the people are not going to be swayed by their feelings around whether they support the one team or the other. And you are going to have this 20% that's made up of 10% who support Murray on the one hand and 10% who support Smith on the other hand. But crucially, what I want to get at, and it's the idea that the conversations that Rogan has, the long-form conversations where he actually allows these conversations to play out, it is in the best interests of the free flow of information and actually allowing people to make informed decisions.
Yeah,
that's my take.
My only comment to the Pareto principle applied to this is, I would think
you don't like the Pareto principle.
I do. I don't mind the Pareto principle. I think it applies where it applies, but I don't think it applies everywhere. Is my concern on it, and so I would think it more like this: there's a football match between Liverpool and Manchester United, and the people who are from Manchester United and are supporters, and the people from Liverpool each go to the match. And let's say Liverpool does particularly well, as they are now, and Manchester does particularly poorly. When the various people leave, the supporters, the Man United supporters are still Man United supporters, and they still have excuses for why their team did badly and not necessarily that Liverpool did well. And Liverpool supporters will say, my team did really well, and not say, well, that team's going through a bit of a rut right now, and actually we weren't that amazing. Okay. What I think is valuable about a lot of these conversations, and it can happen on Rogan, it can happen just in how people interact on social media. So I do it a lot less now, but when I disagree with someone on social media, I don't do it to change that person's mind, because the chances of me doing that are very, very slim.
No, but you're doing it to make sure that everyone else who's tuned into the conversation
That's right.
is actually...
Because the people watching who haven't chosen a side, might not have a side, don't have a position, they will look at that and go, I watched that football match and I support Tottenham Hotspurs, but I actually thought this about the match, right? Sure. And so I think that will apply the same, and that's why I think there's such great value to those conversations, is because they manage to give information, as you say, free flow of information, and allow people in the middle who aren't dogmatically stuck to a position because they support someone or because they have a certain view on the world. It allows those people to make up their minds. And I think that was really valuable.
Yeah. And so, the interesting thing is that I'm on the side of Murray's arguments, but I disagree with his call for expertise. And, and we can do that.
Yes. So, this follows on. I said we needed to talk about Bill Maher. Now, Bill Maher hates Donald Trump.
Yes.
There's no denying that. He's said it himself many times. But he gets invited to the White House. Kid Rock is a friend of Bill Maher's. Kid Rock is also a friend of Donald Trump's. Kid Rock suggests to Bill Maher, why don't you go and sit down and have a dinner with Donald Trump? Because you've said all these things over all these years, and you've never really met the guy. You never spent any time with him. So your perception of him is based completely, essentially, on what Rachel Maddow and others have told you, and what you've seen in clips. So to his credit, Bill Maher says, okay. And he goes himself, Dana White, and Kid Rock, and Trump for dinner. And Trump very charismatically gives them a tour of the White House. And for those of you who aren't aware, Donald Trump is actually quite a keen historian about the White House. And he can tell you about every room and the paintings there and why certain things are the way they are. He has a particular fondness, for example, for the Lincoln bedroom. And he loves giving tours of specifically the residence. And so...
But crucially, he has a deep and abiding respect for the place, which could not be said about his predecessor.
Yes, correct. So it's an interesting quirk of Donald Trump. He truly loves the White House. And anyway, he gives a tour to Bill Maher, and Bill Maher describes this, just being given a tour by Donald Trump and him being very affable, very pleasant, would easily take a joke, which Bill Maher made a couple. And specifically, the thing I found interesting, which I've heard repeated, is that you think that Donald Trump wants to own the room wants to control and direct the conversation. And Maher and others have refuted that and said Donald Trump listens. He spends a lot of time listening. And it feels as if he genuinely, and Maher, who has no reason to say any of this stuff, because again, he doesn't like Trump, but he says that Trump genuinely listens, and it is if he is truly listening. It's not as if he's listening because you're currently talking and he needs to wait until you finish so he can then start the next topic of discussion. He genuinely is listening and responding to you and is interested in what you have to say. And so Bill Maher goes and has this dinner and gives then a monologue on the show, I think a week and a half later on his show, and says, you know, he still is going to disagree with him and call balls and strikes from his perspective, but you know, he's not Hitler. Basically, he's a reasonable human. Maher's biggest complaint is, where is that human the rest of the time? From Maher's perspective, he's this really, in private at least, he's a really nice, thoughtful guy, and Maher's saying he's not enough of that in the public eye, basically. I thought it was very interesting.
So, you know, it comes back to the earlier discussion we were having around Trump's relationship with the two countries you singled out, which is China and South Africa. And I think one thing that is very clear to me in terms of the way in which Trump relates to South Africa on the one hand and China on the other hand, Trump has a deep and abiding respect for Xi Jinping. Anyone who thinks otherwise, they're actually not reading the room correctly. Trump respects Xi Jinping, recognizes that the U.S. is in an existential battle with China. Yeah. And you know, we can talk about that at some length later on, because it cuts to the heart of the entire upending of the global markets that's happening right now. And it literally is, Trump has assessed that this is all about the long-term survival of the United States, where the U.S. cannot be dependent on the goodwill of China for just about everything that makes that society currently function. And this and then in turn ties up with why it's so critical for him to then establish a good relationship with Russia. Because if he's going to want to replace a lot of the things like rare earth elements, for example, at short notice, the place he can get them from is Russia. And he's aware of the fact that the relationship with Russia and China is incredibly strong, but it does not extend to them supporting each other on trade embargoes. So Russia has no problem with China selling to everyone that Russia considers to be enemies. And by the same token, the Chinese have no problem with doing that type of thing. But if you look in terms of Trump and his approach to leadership in our country, there's no respect whatsoever.
No.
There's not been a single thing that in any way shows any sort of admiration, any inclination that they are worthy of respect at any level. And it's a core difference. At the end of this this almighty conflagration on the markets, we are going to have a leveling of the playing fields. You are going to have a China that's going to emerge strong and a U.S. that's going to emerge strong. And the markets are going to settle, and the markets are going to be higher than they've ever been before. And meanwhile, South Africa has been sucking the hind teeth from the EU, and we're going to be completely out in the cold. Look, Namibia has stepped forward and said, you know, we're happy to do zero tariffs with the US. Zimbabwe has stepped forward and said, we're very happy to do zero tariffs with the US. Everyone actually gets what this is all about. It is a reset that is happening, and it's a reset that's fundamentally going to be based on...
And for many of those countries, having zero tariffs with the US is no skin off their backs.
Yes.
Because they don't benefit from charging tariffs to the US. There's no great value to it. They're not making a lot of money off those tariffs. And because they're not net manufacturers, it doesn't really make a big difference. It doesn't harm their industry for the most part to bring in certain American product. And, again, you can be smart about this. For example, I've heard, if we zero rate American tariffs, then America's going to flood us with bad chicken. That's one of the arguments. Their chicken is really bad, and we're going to suddenly have a whole bunch of crappy American chicken on the market. Maybe, but you could avoid that without tariffs. You could simply figure out something about American chicken that is a health regulation you could create.
Yes.
And you could create that in your laws.
And to use the chicken as a very specific example, one of the things that the Americans do that's very different to what Europe does, for example, or what we do, is that we air chill our chickens.
Yes, they wash
it in chlorine.
That's correct.
And it's very simple for us to just have a regulation that says any chicken that gets sold out here
can't be washed in chlorine.
Can't be washed in chlorine. And the problem is solved. It's got nothing to do with tariffs.
Yeah.
It's got everything to do with
and then you wouldn't get American chicken and you'd still have zero tariffs and good relations.
It's kind of like...
And how about
it's kind of like the Japanese saying, yes, you can ship American cars across to the US, but they must have the steering wheel on the right-hand side.
Yeah.
Simple.
I think the tariffs are interesting. We're in a pause phase. Trump has said that's not going to last forever. It's a 90-day pause. We're about a month into that. A little bit less, actually. This is something I want to talk about, the Trump administration and people freaking out about it. I've seen a lot of people on both sides
except this pause phase that he's spoken about. Remember, now he suddenly got 10% across-the-board tariffs that were not there previously.
Yes, for some countries.
Yes. The number of the countries that have zero tariffs, there's basically 2 that I know of right now. But my point is that he suddenly got an uptick in terms of tariff revenue across the board on 99% of goods coming into the US, of 10% in terms of revenue. That was not there previously.
Yeah.
And people are forgetting this. So immediately, you see, if he had started off the other way around and said, I'm going to raise tariffs to 10%, no one would have taken him seriously. But on the other hand, he goes in hell for leather and he says, I'm doing 100% tariffs on the following people.
Yeah, 50 here, 60 there.
Yeah, and everyone kind of, they look in terms of their trade balances and they say, no, hang on a second. We actually need to seriously talk to these guys. And so there's been this steady stream of people who've been beating their way through to Washington to talk tariffs. And the negotiations are happening behind the scenes right now at, frankly, a very dizzy rate.
Yeah.
So there are lots of things that are coming together right now around this. But to come back to the point around South Africa, and I've made the point previously that, yes, in terms of trade, China is a bigger trading partner than the U.S., but we have a trade deficit with China.
Yeah.
And we have a trade surplus with the U.S.
Yeah.
Which allows us
to... Just
to...
explain that for people who don't understand that.
Okay. It basically means we make more money from the U.S. than the U.S. makes from us. And China makes more money from us than we make from them.
Yes, while also destroying our industry, but separate discussion.
That's a separate discussion. But at the most fundamental level... because you have a net positive impact of trade from the U.S., that in turn is allowing us foreign currency that then allows us to buy oil at the most crucial level, because that's an industry that we've pretty much completely destroyed in this country. And if we are cutting off the amount of dollars that we have in order to be able to buy oil, again, our economy is going to be going through plumbing depths that we didn't think were previously possible.
Yeah, that's of significant concern. What do you take of the talk that Cyril Ramaphosa is apparently considering someone like Rolf Meyer, or what's his name? The former leader of the NNP, that idiot,
Martinus van Schalkwyk.
That's it. What do you make of the fact that he's considering those people as ambassadors, as if to try and say, look, here's some Afrikaners who completely disagree with your narrative on Afrikaners.
So I think that Rolf Meyer has street cred. And Rolf Meyer has street cred primarily because of the role that he played in terms of the talks around Northern Ireland.
Okay.
Yeah, I know Ramaphosa takes credit for those talks, but in fact, those talks were brokered by Rolf Meyer.
Oh, I can fully believe that.
Yes.
I mean, we've now seen Cyril Ramaphosa in action for 6 years, and of course as deputy president before that for 8 or whatever it was. And I mean, he's useless. He's not an effective human being. It's very clear to me that Cyril Ramaphosa is one of the best examples in history of right place, right time. That's the reason why he's wealthy. It's the reason why he's in positions of power. He's not a particularly competent individual, and he's fortunate that along the way he's had competent individuals like Rolf Meyer. Much as I disagree with his ideology, he's had competent individuals like that around him. So, could Rolf work as an ambassador?
Well, I don't know whether he'd be up for the job of ambassador, but certainly as a special envoy to replace Mcebisi Jonas, who I think is a walking disaster if he's going to send him across as
we haven't had a show
envoy.
since you appointed Mcebisi.
No, we haven't.
I mean, it's incredible to me because, I mean, I've in my life had employees. Employed people, and I've been an employee, and to just not do basic due diligence on an employee, it seems insane to me. You're going to send a guy to the United States as a special envoy. You only need a special envoy because the relationship is so poor that you've got to create this special title, essentially, so that you can hopefully get a foot in the door. You can sort of say, this isn't just an ambassador. This is a representative of the president, not the representative of the country.
But more to the point, when you appoint a special envoy, the special envoy is not bound by the usual rules of diplomacy, which is why Witkoff has been so effective in terms of being a special envoy on behalf of the Trump administration, to a far greater extent than Marco Rubio would be able to play. You send in someone like Witkoff, who's actually able to have behind-the-scenes discussions that are establishing a framework that is not going to tie down the country
for a long period of time.
For a long period of time.
They're short-term decisions.
Yes, and they're short-term decisions, and you hammer out the details, and then it resides in the purview of the diplomats to come in and rubber stamp the deals that have been hammered out behind the scenes. And you need someone who actually has two things. The one is that you need to have the street smarts in order to be able to do this type of thing. And you also need someone who clearly is not carrying baggage. And the problem with Jonas is that he has a substantial amount of baggage in terms of
this is the background check I'm talking
his
about.
Contempt for the for Donald Trump. The interesting thing, though, and let's just touch on this, that the hagiography on the part of our South African media at the point at which Jonas was appointed, and they were saying, yay, he's a great guy. And then when all of the information emerged around the views
Just remember why he's a great guy. He's a great guy because he didn't take a bribe from the Guptas.
Yes.
That is the single sole reason why he's a great guy. If he had not done that, like if he wasn't in a position to be offered a bribe, we wouldn't even know his name.
But he got rewarded by becoming chairman of MTN, which is certainly worth more than the 600,000 rand that was in a bag that was handed to him at the Gupta's place. So, there are different ways in which you can say that at the end of the day, people end up getting rewarded. But I want to call out the double standards because you now have the media turning around and saying, you must give Jonas the benefit of the doubt, because of the fact that he said this in a different context, in a different time. Do they extend the same courtesy to Roman Kabanak? Did they extend
Ronaldo
this,
Gous.
or to Ronaldo Gous? And we can go on this, but the fundamental hypocrisy of the media commentators who are singing Jonas's praises is, frankly, it's mind-boggling.
Also, I will point out, the Trump administration, there are two things you can say that they don't like. that administration definitely does not like terrorists and communists. Those are the two things you can pretty much say. If you look at the people around him, go look at the background of the people around him. Go look at Waltz. Go look at Stephen Miller. Go look at Gorka. Go look at the people he has surrounded himself with. You can definitely say they are not fans of people with terrorist leanings, and which is, you can see in the way that administration has behaved. And remember, we're not even 100 days yet. It's not even 100 days in. But you can see in the way they've behaved, they basically are cutting Harvard off completely because of that, because they cannot help themselves. Harvard cannot help themselves but try and cozy up to terrorism. And they do not like communism.
Harvard has had to borrow a couple of billion on the open market in order to compensate for the shortfall.
Yeah, because they also refuse to go into the endowment fund. They refuse to dig out of their endowment fund. They just take the interest off the earnings there, but they won't take primary capital. I think that there are just Ralph Mayer at least would be a smarter move, because of what you said in terms of his ability to hammer out deals.
Look, I've known Rolf Mayer personally since 1996. It was the dying days of the National Party, and I had lunch with him and Evia at the Roundhouse in Cape Town, and I rate the guy. And it was, to the long line of screw ups that de Klerk made was the fact that he didn't appoint Rolf as his successor and instead appointed Ernest Kriel, who, ended up promptly retreating to the Western Cape. But I digress on this point. I remember that Rolf and Holomisa then founded the UDM, and then Rolf pulled out from that and went off into business. Rolf and Cyril were partners in Fever Tree Consulting. Yeah. Which was responsible for the turnaround of Home Affairs. You might remember that during Nkosazana's tenure, when there suddenly was an uptick in terms of Home Affairs because of the fact that all of this stuff got digitized and computerized, and suddenly Home Affairs started functioning. Of course, at the point when once again we had regime change that completely collapsed, because there was a need for Home Affairs to start churning out illicit passports for,
certain families.
Certain families among others. But again, I think that Rolf would certainly be one of the good options that we could be sending right now. But, frankly, why not just send Johan Rupert? Because that's a guy who is a dyed-in-the-wool South African patriot, in the sense that he's completely committed to this country, and and you're certainly not going to be able to bribe him with any amount of money. And does he have the best interests of the country at heart? Would he be hardball enough to actually negotiate? But the point that we must come back to is neither of them, Johan Rupert or Rolf Mayer, is going to be in a position to negotiate unless they have something to negotiate.
This is the problem,
and
this is the issue. Look, I think you need to send someone smarter than Jonas or Rasul that you had there before, and you need to send someone that, number one, doesn't hate Trump. Find someone who doesn't fundamentally hate him, who at least understands the man. Okay, on a business level.
Look, frankly, Thabo Mbeki would do an excellent job.
Probably, sure. Probably would too. So would Kgalema Motlanthe,
yes,
to be frank. The problem is Trump's going to turn around and go, you have the following laws in place, and these laws are discriminatory, and they violate human rights, which is against AGOA, for example, and against our country's beliefs, at least for this administration. And so you need to get rid of them. And the problem is that the ANC will not negotiate on those laws. But then again, I wonder, will they really not? And maybe this is something that brings us into the VAT discussion. Because this morning we all woke up to find out that, as far as I can tell, that which was going ahead on the 1st of May, I'm sure like you've been notified by all your service providers, cell phone providers, and whoever else charges you a bill on a monthly basis, internet service providers, etc. You've been told that your bill will increase by 0.5% in terms of the VAT. And now we wake up this morning to discover that looks like that might be off the table. Now, it's very interesting how we got there, because I want to cut out all the noise. We did not get here because of Herman Mashaba and Action SA. If anything, they almost caused more of the problems than anyone else. We didn't get here because of Musi Maimane. And
frankly, we would have had resolution to this far sooner if they had not been.
If they just shut up and sat down. Correct. So Herman, Musi, Rise Mzansi, and Songezo Zibi, and even Gayton McKenzie and the PA.
And the IFP.
And the IFP, yes. And the IFP should hang their heads in shame.
It was a crushing disappointment on my part.
Yes, absolutely.
For the IFP, I expected better from them.
Right. So you have basically, and let's give credit, the DA, the EFF, the MK Party,
Freedom Front Plus.
Freedom Front Plus, and the ACDP. Those were the parties that stood against it. And the DA was the first applicant in terms of taking the ANC to court. Let me just be clear on exactly what happened here. Nothing anyone else did mattered. The DA was ignoring everyone, which is why they got Action SA and Co. to vote for them in parliamentary committee. Because once they voted for the budget to go through, that was an ability for them to then push through the VAT increase and ignore the DA, and ignore the EFF, and ignore the MKP, although they tried to have talks with the EFF.
And with MKP.
And with MKP, obviously couldn't offer them enough, which would have been for MKP get rid of Cyril.
Again, there's an interesting conversation from Jacob Zuma that was leaked by IOL, and I do urge people to go and listen to it, because to Zuma's credit, he makes the very specific point was that they have nothing to offer us based on the fact that the reason why we are here and doing what we want to do, and I'm paraphrasing what he said, is to actually ensure that this stuff stops.
Yeah, I mean, if you can believe Jacob Zuma, as far as you can.
Look, frankly, I do. And, one of the reasons why I do, we've touched on this previously, is because of the fact that it's very clear to me that no matter what type of corruption existed under Zuma, and it's very clear there was corruption, the country was a better run place under Jacob Zuma in every conceivable level. And I am also very clear that none of this commitment to a just energy transition, which is at the heart of
none of it would have happened.
It would not have happened.
No, not at all.
So at that level, I'm giving Jacob Zuma far more credibility than I do to Cyril Ramaphosa. And it really is as simple as that.
Yes.
Life is all about...
It's an A-B test again. It's an A-B test. We had Zuma. We've had Cyril. When were things better in the country? By almost every metric under Jacob.
Yes.
It's as simple as that. So I hear you. But what I want to get back to regarding the point is that the DA then goes to court. The ANC is pushing through the VAT hike with the help of Action SA, Musi and Co. And they go to court. And I don't know if you watched any of the sort of presentations. I don't know, that's probably not the correct word, but certainly with the advocates sort of standing up and presenting their arguments to the judges. And look, I mean, kudos to the advocates. I must give lawyers credit that they really will be able to represent God or the devil, whichever you give them. So the advocate who represented the ANC really did try her level best, but the judges were taking none of it. I mean, the questions coming back at her, she really had to try and spin the best she could, and it was very obvious after the day in court that the ANC was going to lose, and probably very badly. And so after that, what obviously happened is the ANC was then realized that they now had no choice. Either they could embarrassingly lose in court, or they could try and save some political face and not have a VAT increase, which they will then claim victory over. They will say, well, we decided that it was bad for the people as the ANC because we care so much about the people. And they have now come to an agreement, and it looks like we are not going to have a VAT increase. Now, I don't think that's all good news and sort of sunny skies, unicorns and rainbows, because we're still in a deficit, and they still don't have enough money, and they refuse to cut the budget. So all we're going to do is have a budget we can't afford, basically. We were going to have a budget we couldn't afford anyway.
But that's been the case pretty much since 2009.
Yeah. But we're not getting a VAT increase. And I think, and I will be very hard on the DA and am. I find many of their positions indefensible. But this is a victory for the DA. The DA did this. The fact that VAT isn't going up is on them and is thanks to them. And it is their first win in the GNU. And I would say their first win since they ejected Musi Maimane from the party.
Absolutely. I agree with you completely on all of those points. I think that, and, kudos to Helen, because she's almost, single-handedly been at the forefront of this. And Steenhuisen has been, conspicuously absent in terms of the overall framing of the way in which these things were taking place. So I have a kind of more jaundiced view, though, in terms of the court proceedings, because it's very clear to me that the entire judiciary of our country are Ramaphosa judiciary. So, these are Ramaphosa appointees at almost every level. And so even though, from my perspective, Ramaphosa does not control the ANC in the way that he'd like, does his influence over the judiciary extend to an outcome that's going to be tilting in his favor? And frankly, in terms of the battle that has just been fought and I believe now finally concluded, this was actually a victory of Ramaphosa within the ANC against the factions that were digging their heels in the sand and trying to force a dissolution of the GNU. And I'm convinced that that's the way in which this has actually played itself out, that it got to the point where Ramaphosa was able to go to the ANC and say, we have lost this one, and the reason why we have lost this one is because of the fact that we are not going to win it in court. And it gives him a way to then reassert control, which, because frankly, if you look in terms of the amount of money that would have been raised by that 0.5 percentage point increase, was that actually worth breaking apart the GNU? No, this was something that was entirely designed by the internal factions of the ANC, no doubt headed up by Mashatile. And it was all about jostling for control of the heart and soul of the ANC. And I must say that the buffalo has come out tops in this particular battle.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting take in terms of the internal politics of the ANC. I do think, regardless, though, the fact that it's a DA win.
It is a DA win, and I'm not taking anything away from the DA.
I do hope it will be.
But one must also be very clear that it's not just simply those particular forces that are playing themselves out.
I got you. What I would say is that I hope they can learn a lesson here, which is that if the ANC is pushed into enough of a corner, taking into account the factions you're talking about as well, you can get significant movement. And perhaps that is the answer to the problems with Donald Trump in terms of the relationship with this that the country has, which is that if they're pushed into enough of a corner and they can clearly see that losing is the only outcome, they might reverse course. on things where it otherwise appears as if they refuse to do so. And yeah, as I say, I do hope this is a learning lesson. It's nice to see the DA finally getting a win, because everything has been lying down and taking it for almost a year now. And it's just not the point of being in government if you're going to decide to lie in bed with the ANC. Then you got to at least get something out of it every now and again. And this is the first time I can see any sort of success on their part. Up until now, it's just been communist law after communist law, regulation after regulation. And basically nothing that helps the country or moves the country forward.
Okay, but just remember as well, the most dangerous hour comes before victory, and we have to see how this plays itself out.
Yeah.
As you and I are recording this right now, I know that Fikile Mbalula is hosting a press conference where he's no doubt going to be singing the praises of the ANC as having triumphed over the intransigence of the DA, and we'll get to look at that after the fact. But to bring back to the question of what potentially could an envoy going across to the Trump administration have to offer at this point? Well, I think one very basic thing that the DA could persuade Ramaphosa to come on board with right now in terms of the whole subject of BEE.
Sorry about that, just a battery issue, as you were saying, with regards to BEE.
So I was saying that one of the things that we can actually persuade the Trump administration to buy into is the idea of having a sunset clause around BEE. And you sunset it on the basis that you say BEE shall apply to everyone who was born before 1994. But after 1994, we assume that we are all children of a free South Africa, and these clauses will not apply at the point at which the last of the people who were born before 1994 are no longer alive. And I think that that's something that will be good for the country. It'll, actually give a framework for people to be able to work with and to be able to plan going forward. And it's something that the ANC can actually tout as a victory, to say that we were able to secure an advantage for the previously disadvantaged for the longest time, and now we all need to move forward as South Africans. Does Ramaphosa currently have the cojones to be able to do that? Probably not. But if you have a sudden uptick in terms of legislative interest. No, not legislative. In terms of suddenly people within the ranks of the ANC getting taken out by criminal prosecutions, which I think is something that's likely to happen.
Why?
In a very short term.
What makes you think that's going to happen all of a
Because I
sudden?
think that if it had not happened, if it had happened up until this point, it would have been interpreted by people as Ramaphosa wanting to take out his opponents in order to align himself with the DA. But on the other hand, now that you've got Ramaphosa having gone through this particular storm and being relatively silent on a number of issues, I think that you're suddenly likely to find the SIU going after people within the ANC in a short space of time, within the next couple of months, I would say. And let's watch this space very carefully, because my instinct is that that is going to be happening at relatively short notice. Okay, so we've got a couple of things that are happening here. So on the one hand, I'm saying let's have the sunset clause. On the other hand, we've got an entrenchment of power for Ramaphosa that's likely to happen as a result of this seeming loss, which from my perspective is actually a victory for Ramaphosa. And it's an opportunity at the same time for the more obviously corrupt within the ranks of the ANC. And, we could rattle off a list of names, and, many of them are sitting in cabinet. But let's watch and see how this thing actually plays itself out over the next while.
I think from my perspective, you have a little bit too much faith in Ramaphosa and his actual political ability.
I'm not suggesting that he has integrity at any level.
No. But even ability to plan. I think I would be very surprised to see Shamila Batoy doing anything of value anytime soon. She's been an utterly useless prosecutor in her position. Some of the cases should be so simple that it should be straightforward as anything. And essentially, it seems to me she only has interest in political prosecutions which are helpful to certain people. And other than that, she's not really interested, so much so that we basically have a situation where certain police officers, high-ranking police officers, have taken it into their power to solve the crime situation by police-level justice. What's going on in KZN, as an example. It's clear to me that if you are caught pointing a gun in the direction of the police in KZN, you will be shot and killed. And there are stories out of KZN now almost on a weekly, sometimes on a daily basis, of gangs, 4 or 5 men at a time, just being completely taken out. Now, I'm not saying the police are necessarily doing anything wrong. It would be hard to prove. I'm just saying that traditionally you hear stuff like the police, found a gang and there was a shootout. One person was injured, another was killed, and 3 were taken into custody type of story. These stories are all the same. The police found a gang. They approached the house. They opened fire at the people inside, and the police were forced to return fire. And unfortunately, everyone was killed. Now, I have no problem with that. I know there are some liberals just down the road from here who probably constantly wet themselves behind their high walls, electric fences, and patrolling guards in the street, that, God forbid, anyone evil should die. I don't have a problem with that, but what I'm saying is that we have a perversion of our entire system as a result of a prosecuting authority that does nothing around organized crime, nothing around political crime, nothing around tender fraud, and I'm not convinced we'll see much of anything. What I do find interesting is 2 things. One is we have an election next year. In fact, probably just over a year from now. I'd imagine those elections, municipal elections, are always a little bit later in the year, but I imagine those elections would probably be somewhere around August of 2026. And that will be interesting to watch, certainly, as a sort of vibe check of where the country is. And then we have, I think it'll be 1 year later, or will it be 20? No, it'll be 1 year later. It'll be the end of 27. The ANC will have an elective conference. And that elective conference will be jostling for power for 2029. And remember, Cyril Ramaphosa is meant to be out after that because they've so far stuck to 2 terms per president. So you will have someone like Fikile Mbalula trying to get power. You will have someone like Paul Mashatile trying to get power. And no doubt you will have a couple of dark horses coming forth, as we have had before. Let's not forget we had David Mabuza as our deputy president for a period of time. And I think that's really where the interest is. I'm not so interested in Cyril. For me, he's a known entity. I don't think he's going to do anything more of great value here. I think he will continue to push communist policy because I truly believe that's what he believes in as a person. And I would love him to run away from BEE screaming, as you're talking about. I don't know what the hammer is that the Trump administration or anyone else could use against them. I would hope that when they realize it's not just rhetoric and it's not a bit of US aid going to a whole bunch of those very same liberals who have problems with criminals meeting their end, not getting their nice salaries in their NGOs anymore, but when hopefully an envoy or an ambassador sits down with the Trump administration and says the word finally comes across, please understand, America inadvertently and directly gives you X tens of billions, hundreds of billions per year. When we decide we've had enough of this nonsense, you will lose all of that, and let us paint a picture of what your country looks like after that, what your life looks like after that. When we institute sanctions against you and all of the top 100 in the NEC, for example, let's just explain how this will work. We hope you like Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Cape Town a hell of a lot, because those are the only places in the world you will be seeing. We do hope you have everything you need in those places right now.
You currently sound like Martin Luther King giving a "I have a dream" speech.
I am pointing to the fact that I hope that image can be created enough. The same as the court case yesterday created pressure.
It's clear to me that one of the reasons why Ramaphosa is so anxious to send a special envoy across to negotiate is to prevent being Magnitsky'd, basically.
Okay.
And, for people who don't know
The Magnitsky Act.
What the Magnitsky Act is all about, if you go to kanthanpillay.com and search for Magnitsky, you'll find
There's a little bit of promotion going on there, Ken.
No, I mean, this is a piece that I wrote more than a decade ago, and it's a great piece because it actually talks about the relationship between Bill Browder and Magnitsky, who was, basically taken out by under Putin's watch, and which led to a slew of things. But we need to just pull out again, once again, because fascinating things happening now in many parts of the world. So I first want to take us to India, and we really need to touch on this because this is probably the single most significant thing that is happening in the world right now.
And I know what you're going to say, so I want to preface this by saying you're going to hear this from Kanthan and be like, hold on, I didn't realize this was a big deal, because from how it's been reported in the media, it's been reported as just another event. But do continue.
So essentially, what happened it was day before yesterday, if my timing is right, in Pahalgam in Kashmir. There were tourists who were at a tourist resort around a lake, and they were hit upon by Islamist terrorists. And let's be very clear, they were Islamist terrorists. And the men were all lined up. And the men had their ID checked, and those who didn't have ID were made to drop their pants in order to check whether they were Muslims. And
circumcised or not,
they were circumcised or not. And of course, because these were all Hindus, they were uncircumcised, and 26 of them were executed point blank
for being Hindu.
Were executed for being Hindu, and the women were basically told, "Watch your men getting killed, and go back and tell people that you are not welcome in this part of the world." It's it's very easy to draw a kind of a correlation with what happened on October 7th, certainly not on the scale of October 7th, but certainly in terms of the sheer barbarity and the sheer targeting purely on the basis of ethnicity of the people who are involved. This is, I think it has been a seismic shock to the psyche of India as a nation. The fallout now is incredible. So India has recalled its diplomats from Pakistan. It has expelled all of its diplomats, all of the Pakistani diplomats from India. It has given every Pakistani in India 48 hours to leave the territory.
Wow.
And Modi has said that this is not going to end until every one of these terrorists have been exterminated. So that's the starting point. But the more crucial thing that we need to talk about is that back in 1960, there was, and again, geography is so crucial here, John, and most people actually don't understand how this actually works. But in 1960, there was a treaty that was hammered out between India and Pakistan. Because remember that most of the rivers that flow into Pakistan, and we're talking very specifically about the Indus River, it rises in India, and it flows into
source.
the source is in India, and it flows down into Pakistan. And the treaty that was signed in 1960 effectively gave water allocation from 6 rivers of the Indus Basin. It allowed for allocation of water to flow into Pakistan. So as part of that treaty, India was not allowed to do things like putting up hydroelectric dams on these rivers. The net result is that 80% of the water from these rivers that rise in India flows into Pakistan. And Pakistan is entirely dependent upon this water in order to survive. India has now unilaterally withdrawn from this treaty. Now, a couple of years ago, someone made the point to me. It was a very bright young student of mine. When I was interviewing people for the E-News journalism training program more than 20 years ago, and I interviewed all of these very bright youngsters, and I would ask them, what's the most significant thing that's going to be happening in the world over the next millennium? Because I took over E-News in 2001, with the start of the millennium, and there was this one very bright young girl who said, well, the wars of the next millennium are going to be fought over water. And I immediately took her onto the program on that basis. And she went on to do fantastically well, became bureau chief for ABC News, and now has a private communications company in the US and is doing fabulously well for herself, which is great for a Kapsa Clearlung Macy. But, be that as it may. Right now, you have effectively India declaring war against Pakistan. That's what has happened.
Yeah.
In the past 24 hours.
And the response of the Pakistanis?
They are immediately saying that India cannot unilaterally abrogate from the treaty. Actually, India can.
Yeah, that's how treaties work.
Yes,
two consenting parties, basically.
Yeah, and the fact is, Pakistan may protest, but who's going to enforce it?
Pakistan hasn't offered to go after the terrorists for India.
No, but
wouldn't that help?
Remember that all of these attacks have come from Pakistan-administered Kashmir.
Yeah,
and this has been the case, for the longest time. So again, to go back a couple of years, when one of the things that Modi did when he came into power in this time round was to unilaterally terminate a special arrangement that Pakistan that Kashmir had in terms of the Indian states. So there were preferential rules that were in place for the territory of Kashmir. This is Indian-administered Kashmir, that basically gave preferential treatment to Muslims. Mm-hmm. So, Indians from the rest of India were not allowed to come and buy territory in Kashmir, as an example. And so in August 2019, Modi abolished statehood for Kashmir, declared it to be national territory, which brought it under the Constitution of India, and which meant that suddenly Kashmir just became another part of India.
Sure.
Yeah. And subsequent to that, the security situation in Kashmir was really good because, of course, it was the national government that was administering security and securing the borders. And then the Supreme Court of India said, no, you've actually got to run elections in the state and, hand over control because that's part of the democratic process and so forth. It's very clear to me that if national control over Kashmir had continued, this terror attack would not have happened. And again, it's one of those situations where you have an overreach on the part of the judiciary that, ultimately ends up with chaos in a particular part of the world. So the situation right now that we have is that you have the government in Pakistan, which, remember, is basically a government that was put in place by the Biden regime because they engineered a regime change to remove Imran Khan, the democratically elected prime minister of the country, and then subsequently put him in jail. And so Pakistan has been that basket case, which has been able to continue based on the fact that they had the support of the Biden regime. Are the Islamists in Pakistan going to get support from the Trump administration, particularly given the close ties that India and Israel have around the question of Islamist terrorism? And
Trump's personal relationship with Modi. He has a close personal relationship there. And now you've just had J.D. Vance actually in India while this took place.
And the attack took place on the day that J.D. Vance was visiting. So you are now going to effectively have. Remember that there have been two wars full-blown wars between India and Pakistan to date, both of which Pakistan has lost. And the second of those wars led to Pakistan losing what was East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh as a result. I can't see a situation going through this process where India is not going to militarily take Pakistan-occupied Kashmir.
So we finally solved the Kashmir question, basically.
It's going to be bloody because remember that these are both nuclear armed nations.
Yeah, so that's my concern and my question to you. You have two nuclear armed nations. Does that matter? Do nukes come into it?
So the first thing that we need to consider is that the problem with nukes is not the destructive capability of nukes. The problem with nukes is always fallout. Because once you contaminate a land with nukes, recovery from the after effects of nukes is difficult. But in terms of sheer kilotonnage, are they conventional weapons that are of significantly greater destructive capacity than nukes currently? Yes, they are. And we saw the fact that the Russians used this against Ukraine, where you basically send a missile into the stratosphere and drop it very precisely on a target. And the sheer impact that, you simultaneously detonate multiple warheads at the point of impact. And the destructive capability is significantly more than nukes. So I don't think that this is a war that's going to be fought with nukes. But it's very clear to me that in terms of the missile technology capabilities, remember that India has these BrahMos missiles, which were designed in conjunction with the Russians, which are homegrown missiles that are produced by India, and the sheer volume of these that they have. And just remember, in terms of the geography of Pakistan versus the geography of India, India, to a large extent, completely surrounds Pakistan on the eastern side. And so the ability for India to be able to react decisively at short notice in the event of there being any missile attacks upon India, it's scary stuff. And we haven't yet started to even see the way in which the stuff is going to unravel. Now, at the same time that this is happening, you've got to take the view in terms of the backdrop that's happening in other parts of the world, because you know that there have been talks that have been conducted, direct talks between the U.S. and Iran for the first time. And if people want to get some detail around where this is likely to go, I don't normally point people in the direction of The Guardian because they spin things. But, when The Guardian says stuff in terms of what's likely to emerge as a result of those talks. I'm inclined to believe some of the stuff that's being touted. So to put this in perspective, Trump wants to completely eliminate the possibility of Iran ever acquiring a nuclear weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And so as part of the deal that they're trying to strike, the Iranians have to give up all of their enriched uranium, and they need to hand it over to a third party, the third party in this case being Russia. Okay. And which again ties in with the reason why it's so important for Trump to now be able to strike a good relationship with the Russians, because he's got this larger global picture that he's basically playing out. Mm. If he's able to pull this out, you'll have an easing of sanctions against Iran, and obviously there's lots of other stuff that Iran's going to have to commit to. Cutting off support for Hezbollah, cutting off support for the Houthis, all of that stuff is going to be part of the stuff that's currently under discussion. And frankly, I think it's stuff that Iran is going to go for, because the alternative is one that they can't actually afford.
Well, they can't afford it at the moment. They're busy running out of funds.
Right. So, but essentially, you've got this kind of encircling of the historical hubs of Islamist terrorism that's been that's now taking place at a dizzy rate around the world. And you have to see what's happening right now in terms of India and Pakistan against the backdrop of that, because there is not going to be any of those players in the Middle East who are going to take the side of Pakistan in this particular. Because remember that the Saudis, more than anyone else, have been pushing for this peace initiative that's going to constrain Iran at the level of. I mean, remember that the Saudis are the people who have most suffered from the result of the funding of the Houthis. Mm-hmm. And they very much want to get rid of that threat, which is literally on their doorstep. And then you have Hezbollah, of course, in Lebanon. And the majority of the people of Lebanon very clearly want Hezbollah out of there. And we've had the situation where you've had the overthrow of Assad. You are now going to have an entrenchment of Israeli positions in strategic territories in Syria.
Yeah.
And
the goal line is never coming back.
Yeah, exactly. So all of these things are now coming together. So Pakistan right now is in an incredibly difficult position, and so the question is: are the Pakistanis going to be dumb enough to actually take on India in a war? Which I'm very clear that India will win it, but the human capital cost is going to be horrendous, because there's going to be deaths in terms of millions on both sides in the event of this war actually taking place. Or on the other hand, is there likely to be a situation where Pakistan gets encircled diplomatically and physically for a period right now, and where you have strong pressure on the part of the United States to restore democratic processes within that country. And frankly, I think that the release of Imran Khan from captivity and allowing for free elections in Pakistan is going to be a crucial part of that process. But there is such a lot that is happening right now at this level.
It's interesting. Pakistan seems like the kind of nation that's been left behind in terms of the reforms taking place elsewhere.
It's like South Africa at that level.
Yes. I would say Iran, Pakistan, and South Africa in many respects. But if I look at specifically Islamist doctrine and sort of radicalism, you know, you've got Iran, which refuses to walk away from sort of hijab laws, constantly kind of abuses women, hangs anyone that's an apostate or a gay or whatever from cranes in the center of the town. That kind of behavior, and the same things that occur basically in Pakistan.
But again, you know, that's a question of PR, because remember that the Saudis execute publicly execute more people than anyone else in the Middle East. And
Sure, but they've walked away. What I'm saying is they've walked away from the worst excesses of those types of beliefs.
Well,
not all of them.
Yeah, well,
but
they're certainly not chopping up Khashoggi
in the
and putting
time
him,
that the
flushing it down
Iranians
the
have
river
stuck
anymore.
to those rules and laws very strictly and have disappeared women who've taken off their hijabs and things like that. Saudi has allowed women to drive, allowed women not to have a male
Frankly,
escorts or whatever.
John, I don't give a shit what the Saudis and the Iranians do within their borders because I don't live in those countries. If their religion is telling them that they have a particular role for women in their societies, I do have a problem with the Iranians funding the Houthis.
You can't disconnect these things, though,
No,
Kanthan.
actually, we can.
No, I don't think so.
And the reason why we can actually disconnect these things is because we don't want a situation where we are ending up effectively needing to shape our relationship with other countries based on a moral premise rather than enlightened
I'm not talking
self-interest.
about the morality. I'm talking about if your society believes in subjugating women because that's the doctrine, and that's the most intense interpretation of that doctrine, because I will point out there are Muslim countries that don't force women to do the things Iran does. Okay? So if your interpretation of the doctrine is the most intense with regards to the subjugation of women, then the chances are your interpretation on the killing of infidels, for example, and the need to spread your religion through terror will be as intense. And so all I'm saying is if you cool the interpretation across the board, because that is politically expedient for the leaders to do, which has happened in Saudi Arabia as an example, then what happens is you have less of that as a result.
Look, I don't want to get into we could probably spend quite a while talking about the internal dynamics of women in Saudi Arabia versus women in Iran. I'm very clear from where I'm sitting that women in Iran are better off than women in Saudi Arabia. Does that mean that women are well off in Iran? Absolutely not. But all of this stuff comes down to relativity and who's got good PR. And I'm very clear that the Saudis have got better PR, but are more oppressive to women than the Iranians are. I don't find either of them to be acceptable.
My point is,
and I'm not picking sides right now between
if
the Saudis.
I'm looking and I'm saying to people, tell me 30 years ago, list 5 countries that were very sort of heavy in their very strict Islamic law, and really were well known for pushing that with regards to women, or with regards to anyone who didn't follow their religion, or with regards to other religions having religious sites in their country, or whatever it happens to be. Name 5. 30 years ago, that's a very easy list to come up with. It's a lot harder. You have to think a bit more today to come up with that list. You may come up with similar countries, and it's not like Saudi Arabia is New York. It's not. But the point is that a lot of those countries have moved quite significantly from where they were. If I think about Pakistan, it hasn't moved an inch. At least from what you're saying, PR-wise. Maybe none have moved in reality, and it's just PR that I'm being sold. But it seems to me that I can point to official laws which have been changed in Saudi Arabia, and I can also point to official laws that have been passed in Pakistan, one as recently, I think, as last year, with regards to rape of women. And essentially, basically, that's, someone rapes your sister, the punishment is you get to rape her sister. That's kind of now enshrined in law. So what I'm saying is it's interesting to me that a lot of countries have moved forward and left behind some of these worser elements. At least they don't publicize them. At least they don't make them frontline policy. But Pakistan seems to be that one country that's very much been left behind.
Yes.
And I think that will have a significant impact on any kind of conflict with India, because I feel as if there are far less Muslim countries that otherwise 30 years ago may have said, you are attacking our brothers, that may turn around and go, we do not see eye to eye with you anymore in the current way the world is conducted and the way we want the world to see us. And so our support for you might at best be neutral, or maybe we don't say anything. We may not come out in favor of India, for example, but we're not going to come out on your side very, very clearly and
I
definitively.
think that that's a good assessment in terms of the way in which it's likely to play itself out.
Yeah.
And but yes, I think that watch the situation very carefully. We just at the beginning of this right now, and this is going to be huge. And let's just hope that the outcome that we have is not going to be a full-blown war, because that is going to be an absolute friggin' disaster.
All right, so it will be interesting to see what happens. Obviously, big involvement, I'm sure, from the US in any conflict that takes place. The one thing I just wanted to say, because I had said that Trump isn't even at 100 days. I think in about a week's time he'll be at 100 days. And what I find interesting is that there's people on, obviously, the side that always has disliked him and, is against him, and Orange Hitler and all that. That side is very much, still everything he's doing is terrible and he's so bad and all the rest. Also find it interesting to find people who supported him who are now sort of going, oh, well, they don't like that he's doing this or that, or it's chaotic, or this doesn't make sense. It's not even 4 months, folks. He's got 4 years. Someone said to me the other day, I went to a lunch with friends, and they said to me, oh, so, what do you think about the Donald Trump presidency? And I turned around and said, I think that he's going to be president of the United States for 4 years. And I think wait and see.
So the interesting thing, though, is going to be between now and the midterms.
Yes.
And that's the crucial thing, because if he doesn't achieve everything that he needs to achieve and to show tangible results for the American voting populace between now and the midterms, then he could effectively end up losing control of Congress, which then, puts him back in the position that he was in his previous presidency. So he's got every incentive at this point. If there's going to be any damage that gets caused, and if you use the stock market as a measure of damage, the reduction in value on the stock market that took place, it's recovered significant chunks of that, but by and large, that's damage that's in the short term. But he's got to do that damage now and be able to tell a good story by the time the midterm elections come around, which is going to be in 2026, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. I would say, look, exactly as you say, the worst part of the damage from any of his policies, be it tariffs or be it any of the Doge stuff, in terms of the cuts to government, that has to happen probably by 1 year before those midterms.
Correct.
And then everything from then has to be relatively positive. Look, the other thing I will point out is that voters in general, globally, have very short memories. I would like people to remember all the parties that voted for a VAT increase come the rest of your lives. Don't vote for those parties. But the truth is that in 2029, a whole bunch of idiots in Parkhurst are going to go and vote for Razem Zansi. All the people who go and work at media outlets are going to go vote for those communists, colorful communists, but communists. They're not going to remember the VAT stuff. And the Americans are no different. Eggs were very highly priced when Joe Biden left office. They've already dropped significantly. So was fuel, although Biden had emptied the
strategic
reserves,
fuel reserves, yes.
to make that cheaper. But it was still heavy. It was still heavy pricing. So the thing is Trump could bring eggs down to all-time low prices, and groceries for that matter, and he could bring fuel down. But often those things drop in priority. The good example is immigration. So immigration was the biggest issue going into the presidential election. It now doesn't even rank in the top 5. And the reason is because they had tens of thousands of people coming into the country a day under Biden. And under Trump, they have under 10,000 a month. So it's just an incredible. It's like a 95% reduction. And so, that voters forget things quite quickly. So as soon as things are solved, the issues are not front of mind, and you don't get much credit for having solved them. They only want you to solve the next problem. And so it'll be interesting what those midterms are about, because I don't think the issue that those midterms are about exists yet. Or at least it's not front of mind.
That's a very astute comment. And yeah, it's I think that you are going to see a settling of the global markets at a number of levels by the time we get to those midterms. I think we're going to see an end to the war in Ukraine at that point. And so the question is what those issues are going to be is not something that we know at this stage.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we did take some time to give you a new episode, but we have given the people 2 hours of show. I think that's pretty reasonable. I mean, obviously they pay a lot for this.
I think we should just, remind people to go and have a look at that, the appellate division's decision to say that the city of Joburg must provide housing for the waste pickers.
Yes, and close to where they pick waste as well, because it wouldn't be fair for them to have to travel to work. You, unfortunately, you as a middle class peasant, if you live in Four Ways and need to drive to Overton to work, that's your problem. But if the waste picker isn't close enough to where he needs to pick waste, that's the city's problem. And
but more importantly, I must pay rates for the privilege of doing that.
Yes, the taxpayer.
And I'm utterly appalled at at this decision. There's it's a substantial judgment that I think at many levels just represents why, even when you have, no matter who happens to be the government in charge of running the city, if you're going to have judgments like this that are going to effectively prioritize the well-being of illegal occupants of private property over and above the rolling out of services to the people who are actually paying for them, we can never recover from that.
No, there isn't. There's no recovery from that. And in fact, unfortunately, we have similar things in some respects happening in Cape Town. Someone messages me this morning, a friend of mine, and says the DA hates the middle class. That was the message he sent to me. He said his rates are going to go up between 20 to 30%. And he doesn't feel he gets decent services for that. Yes, Cape Town runs better than Johannesburg, no doubt about that, and many other cities in the country. But, the reason they're increasing the rates is because the DA constantly feels it needs to take from the rich to give to the poor. And so my friend and many others will be taxed an extra 20 to 30%. They will get nothing extra for that money. And that money will go straight
Nyanga
into...
does have the largest murder rate on the entire continent, so there's that.
Yes, but they don't live in Nyanga. And the people in Nyanga don't pay rates, many of them. Mm-hmm. And so
but that's why the DA's got to take money and spend it on.
Yeah, so that's what happens. And I think ultimately, it's going to come down. The DA thinks they're a forever party. I think if Jacob Zuma hadn't said it, the DA would say something as arrogant as "we will rule Cape Town until Jesus comes." And the message I have for you guys is your time is coming. And I don't really want it to come. I think a lot of you are good people. I think you're nice people. I think you run the city pretty well. But you can't keep taking from the suburbs to give to the townships. You can't just incessantly do that on an increasing level and not service people, because they will revolt against you eventually. It will take time because they are very wet liberals. But even the wettest of liberals will become anarchists or right wingers, actual classical liberals at some point, and say, sorry, but what I pay for my family and my children is for me first, and then for everyone else. And good luck to you with that policy. I think you will find it more and more difficult to win elections as time goes on. Any last words from you?
Just want to point out that the last exchange of bodies took place between Russia and Ukraine last week. This was specifically with regard to the Kursk region. There were 41 Russian bodies that were handed over to the Russians, and there were 909 bodies that were handed over to the Ukrainians. And if you want a very graphic representation of which way this war is going, just look at that ratio of 909 to 41, and that'll tell you how this war is going, no matter what people might tell you to the contrary.
Yeah. Right. So 1,000 to 50, basically. Good. As always, we hope you've enjoyed this. Hopefully my voice will have recovered. I hope I haven't annoyed you too much with the frog in my throat. We will...
Don't worry, Ramaphosa will boil that frog for you.
slowly and then very quickly. We hope you've enjoyed it. Please like, if you listen on any of the platforms and they offer you that option, like the podcast. If you're watching it on YouTube, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the show. We will catch you next time.
And on the 17th of May at Exclusive Books, Nickel Way at 12 noon.
I thought we had gotten away. With it. 17th of May, Nickel Way. You can go meet Kanthan and probably me as well if you would like to. Thank you as always for listening and watching. We will catch you next time. Cheers.